Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Sunday, April 13th, day 555 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our partner in crime, Jessica Steinberg, wearing a different hat today as culture editor. Hi, Jessica. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Amanda. Thanks for having me.
We are recording ahead with the Passover holiday, and we are going to be discussing in general Israeli art since October 7th, 2023, and how it's being exhibited right now. She's going to bring us several examples of current exhibits, and we'll get a sense of what's on show, especially during this Passover holiday. We'll also speak about the families of hostages and how they're preparing themselves for this Passover holiday, a second in which their loved ones are still in captivity. So we will discuss all of this and more when we're back.
I like what I do as a Jew, and I find it interesting and meaningful, but I want to learn about what's out there and how do the rest of our people connect.
You come in knowing some things, but nobody here knows everything, because everyone has had like puzzle pieces, and together we kind of make up this whole larger puzzle.
I think the Hartman Fellowship has impacted me as a Jewish leader more than any other Jewish program that I've done, because it's sort of broadened my horizon on what exactly it means to be a Jewish teen and what sort of Jewish teen learning looks like.
Jessica, I know it's a bit of a switch of roles here, but I think people aren't aware that most of your work and my work as well is not on these podcasts. And you are actually a culture editor, and you've also picked up since October 7th another beat, which is covering the hostages and especially their families. So wearing those two hats, I'd like to zoom out a little bit and talk about culture in general since October 7th, especially Israeli artists here in Israel, and how you've noted things shifting since you've been covering this beat, the culture beat, for, decades at this point. So what are you seeing? A decade plus. What are you seeing as the shift here, Jessica, since October 7th?
Right. So what I always say since October 7th is that it took a few weeks to really see any culture, any arts and culture emerging. And it was all, of course, about October 7th for Israeli artists, whether they were musicians or painters or illustrators, ceramicists, sculptors. Basically, everyone was reacting like every Israeli was to what was happening. And I often talk about people like Shoshka Engelmeyer, Zev Engelmeyer, who does these illustrations called the Daily Postcard. He still does them and posts them on social media, basically drawing with markers the image of the day. It could be of a hostage family. It could be of a bereaved family of a soldier who was killed. Now it's of released hostages sometimes, but also hostages who are still in captivity. And so that's what you saw. It was sort of a rolling out of artists themselves reacting to what was happening. And then very slowly, probably in November 2023, really more into December, you started seeing exhibits. Exhibits at the major museums, at the Israel Museum, at the Tel Aviv Museum of Art, at smaller museums like Ramat Gan and Herzliya, Bat Yam, Anu, in the Tel Aviv University, and every major exhibit had to do with October 7th. It was. I
just want to stop you here because it's such a huge pivot for an institution to make, because in general, when you say, Jessica, most of these exhibits are planned even years ahead, and all of a sudden they had to pivot, the word of the day, but also find a different space, find a different location for what they were planning on having. How can you describe a little bit this situation, this big turn of a massive ship such as the Tel Aviv Museum or the Israel Museum?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Yes, basically, an exhibit can take 2-3 years to be planned. And all these institutions said, we're just not going to be able to put that exhibit up. We're going to put it on hold. Sometimes they had to because it was artworks that were coming from abroad. And all of a sudden, those institutions abroad said, we're not going to send our works to Israel right now because we were embroiled in a war and still are. But more often than not, it was just saying, we can't have an exhibit about Degas or Monet or, pick a contemporary artist. We can't do that right now. We have to do something else. And then they would go into their collections and the curators would start thinking about what they had, also speaking to artists and saying, what do those artists have in their studios that relates to what was happening? And unfortunately, a lot of Israeli artists had works that related, in a sense, to what happened on October 7th because of years of war, years of attrition, of terrorist attacks, of their reactions to the events of the last, 75 years. And that's how they did it.
Right. And so now we're kind of in a new phase, when you say, Jessica, where the institutions are actually planning with this in mind. They're able to plan a rollout of some new way of looking at the conflict, a new way of looking at the hostage situation.
Right. There's that. And also, I think for the most part, a lot of these institutions, they can't really bring themselves to completely ignore it. So they don't want to. Their viewers, their audiences don't want to either. I'm thinking about a couple of different exhibits that just opened up. I was in Haifa at the Haifa Museum of Art, 2 new exhibits. Actually did not really look at October 7th that much. Sometimes certain artists' works touched on it, but for the most part, it wasn't about October 7th. But then you go to a museum like the Holon Design Museum, or I think officially Design Museum Holon, which is just outside of Tel Aviv, and they just opened with a big splash, an exhibit called Heroines, which is about fashion in World War II. And why fashion in World War II? Because the curator, Ya'ara Kedar, who's a very well-known art historian and fashionista, she was thinking about how people kept on going throughout the years of the Second World War. And one of the industries that really had to keep on going was fashion. And there were survivors and victims who were fashion designers. She took one exhibit and rethought it, an exhibit of a woman named, Hetty Strand, who did not survive the Shoah, did not survive the Holocaust, but sent her designs in an envelope to family in Milwaukee in the U.S.
Milwaukee is actually where right next to where I was born. I want to also just nail down and pause on this exhibit a little bit more, because I follow you on social media, and anyone who doesn't should. And you posted really interesting videos from there of these mannequins who are wearing, I don't know, I'm not a fashion person, as you know, but who are wearing a cloth that looks to me as gingham. Would you call it gingham? I think that's what it is, like checkered, and it reminds you of a tablecloth, and it brings the whole home and hearth to the center of that section of the exhibit as well. And talk a little bit about why she chose heroines, meaning obviously we're in a war and this is a little bit of a war theme, but she's centering it, this curator, on home and hearth, it appears to me at least.
Right. So social media, it doesn't always hone in on everything. Basically, she took a few different women, heroines, who used fashion as a way of moving forward in their life during World War II. One was that woman, Hetty, that I spoke to, who was a victim, but her designs lived after she did. The reel that you saw of the gingham looking was actually flour sacks. It was clothing made out of flour sacks because there wasn't enough fabric to make clothing. So designers and seamstresses used everything they could find. Flour sacks were then printed with prints, with flowers, with gingham, because they knew that people were using the sacks once they were done in order to make clothing. Women made wedding dresses out of parachutes because there was no silk to be had. And that's the idea of the exhibit. It really looks at a wide swath of women from different experiences and what they did to keep on going. And of course, as one of the researchers in the exhibit said to me, a fashion designer I happened to know for many years from Tel Aviv, she was there and she said, there were victory pins that were created during World War II for the Allies. And some of them had diamonds, like that one made by Cartier. But it really is akin to the yellow hostage pins that everyone now wears, which were first 3D printed by an industrial designer in Tel Aviv. And that's the idea,
Right.
kind of bringing that together.
Okay, we're going to go to a short break and then we're going to discuss two other exhibits on show right now.
I and my wife, we were mourning with people. But because of the way that things have changed, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, there was a feeling that, and this is the substance of an exchange I had in Dissent with another member of the magazine's editorial board, the kind of progressive movement, I think a lot of people in the progressive movement felt, well, if we make a big deal out of Jewish pain and suffering in the wake of October 7th, it'll be instrumentalized and used to justify the war. That's a generous interpretation. And my argument was actually not mourning legitimates the war. And this is because people don't understand also how Israelis feel themselves to be in the world. That if you were able to mourn, then you also might be able to say to people, look, this, what happened is heinous and horrible. And there is another way other than living by the sword forever. But when the world's response to this is, you got what you deserved, and this is even a good thing, well, you only confirm the sentence that the whole world is against us.
I would like to talk about an exhibit that is in Holon's neighborhood in Bat Yam in a structure that is called the Mini Guggenheim, or at least nicknamed that. And I've not been there, but can you set the stage for us a little bit about this spiral structure in Bat Yam, a city close to Tel Aviv on the coast?
Sure. So the museums of Bat Yam are called Moby Museums of Bat Yam, which is kind of a fun name. And this is the Bat Yam Art Museum, which is a building built as a spiral. It's small. Actually, so is the Holon Design Museum, but that's built by architect Rona Rad. It looks like a ribbon that's streaming out. The Moby, the Bat Yam Museum, was built as a structure probably in the last 30 years or so. The staff, the curatorial staff of the museum, like to call it the Mini Guggenheim for the New York Museum that is in a spiral. This is a much less impressive structure in that sense. But as they kept on pointing out during this press tour of the exhibit, it does have the feeling of a synagogue, actually, of a space that is really centered and quiet and whole. And it's a very good setting for the exhibit called Hoshana, which can be translated as salvation, a solo exhibit by an artist named Ester Schneider. She was born in Russia to a religious family, actually, very unusually, came to Israel at a young age, was brought up Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. The family then kind of moved a little bit more slightly to the left, religious Zionist family. And her works are upcycled pieces of furniture, arms and legs of chairs that she then creates into tabernacles and a huge sukkah structure that really echoed the Nova tent at the Desert Rave that was so horribly that the people were so horribly massacred on October 7th. And she clearly was in that head. And Hoshana also is a prayer that is said on Sukkot, which was the holiday during which October 7th took place, of course. So, and this is more than a year later, this exhibit, right? So she's been working on it for more than a year. And everyone who was there could immediately identify, in a sense, religious or not, mostly secular, could identify with exactly where she was going with this. This was her outpouring of what she had been thinking about for the last year and a half. And that is, again, that's really the theme that you keep on seeing in so many exhibits and in so many places. Artists just doing their thing, thinking about what they're thinking about right now.
Let's turn now to a former resident of Kibbutz Be'eri who was at Be'eri on October 7th, witnessed experienced the disaster that struck that kibbutz. And this is Sofie Berzon Mackie, who was Kibbutz Be'eri's artistic director, essentially, of a little gallery that they had at the kibbutz. And she, like so many who lived in these really decimated kibbutzim, has been moving around since October 7th. She's been since I think it's December in Kibbutz Hatzerim, which is also in the south. But she and the art of the kibbutz have been unhoused and rehoused and unhoused and rehoused several times. So right now it appears to me from reading your piece that Tel Aviv is giving a space to the kibbutz art, but Sofie herself is also creating art and is exhibiting in Jerusalem. So tell us a little bit about Sofie and this theme of unhoused and rehoused in terms of the art.
Absolutely. She's sort of Sofie and I got to know each other, I guess, last January or so, 2024. I was following the Be'eri Gallery, which, as you said, is a small gallery on the grounds of the kibbutz that was decimated, burned down on October 7th. There were two gallery directors, Sofie and Ziva Yalin, who is the wife of Chaim Yalin, who used to be a head of one of the councils, regional councils in the Negev. She left the gallery after October 7th, has continued creating art. And like many curators, they're also artists. So Sofie, I got to know her because she was having a solo exhibit at a gallery in Jerusalem, and that was last winter, and it was of her art, but it was, of course, very tied to October 7th. And we kept in touch ever since because I just really wanted to know how she was doing. She, her three kids, and her partner went to a friend's house after October 7th, fleeing the bullets that were still flying on the kibbutz. They then joined the rest of the kibbutz members in a hotel in the Dead Sea for months and months on end. They were all in one room, 5 members of a family. And then the family, the whole kibbutz had been invited by Kibbutz Hatzerim, which is outside Beersheba. They were invited already by that kibbutz in December 2023 to settle there for the time being until everyone knew what was going to happen to their own kibbutz. And the kibbutz had accepted, but it takes time to build a new neighborhood for, 800 families or so, or 600 families. And they basically brought in caravans and placed them in a very kibbutz-like setting in Kibbutz Hatzerim. Sofie and her family, like all the others, were supposed to move in, I think, August 2024, but their caravan wasn't ready. And then she and about 17 other families had to decide what were they going to do? Where were they going to go? Were they going to stay in this hotel room in the Dead Sea, where the educational system that was temporary had already been dismantled? They already had their kids enrolled in these Hatzerim area schools. In the end, they went back to Be'eri for several months. She said, I went back home. Her house was still standing. It was actually kind of nice to be back home where she grew up. She's the daughter of a Be'eri-raised father and an English mother. Her mother had been a volunteer on the kibbutz, and then they lived in England, and then they came back to the kibbutz in the 80s, and her mother died of cancer. But her whole life has been on Be'eri. Now she's in Hatzerim in a caravan, which really feels like a nice little house with a deck, and she has fruit trees. And the gallery, again, this is like this nomadic story. The gallery had already been invited within weeks of October 7th by the city of Tel Aviv to take over a space, a really lovely space in a building called Beit Romano in South Tel Aviv. And it's been there since January 2024. I've been there several times. It's usually a solo show by one artist. Most of the shows, like everything we've been talking about, relate in some way or another to October 7th. And the gallery is being hosted for free by the owner of the building and by the city of Tel Aviv. But they already have plans to rebuild the gallery in Be'eri. There are architects who are vying for the project. They're rebuilding it as part of an overall cultural center in Be'eri in an old silo that's been unused for many decades. And Sofie told me she and her family decided to move back to Be'eri. Every family is making that decision for themselves. They will move back to Be'eri, but not to their old house. They're going to move into a new house in a new neighborhood. And we're going to keep in touch. In fact, we are going to, when there is a Times of Israel community trip to Israel in May, we're going to be visiting with Sofie in the Be'eri Gallery in Tel Aviv.
Excellent. Wow, Jessica, that's so powerful. Let's turn to our final story, which is probably going to move me to tears, so be prepared. And we're talking about how the hostage families are preparing for a second Passover Seder without their loved ones. And of course, we're recording before the holiday, but one of the endeavors that you've reported on so far is a Haggadah for children that was created by a mother of a hostage, Nimrod Cohen, and his parents, Vicky and Yehuda, received, I believe, a first sign of life from him quite recently, or at least knowledge of how he's being held in captivity, actually, which is just terrible. We're being told he's held in a cage, just unthinkable to try to imagine. And she, in any case, is creating a Haggadah for children with some of the iconography that has come up throughout this 18 months of captivity, including Emily Damari's hand with the victory sign. And I just can't, it's so powerful to think about this. So Jessica, describe this Haggadah and how else parents, families of these hostages who are experiencing a second Seder in captivity are dealing with all of this.
Yeah. The way I actually found out about the Haggadah was many days or many weeks, I kind of vibe between arts and culture and hostages. So I might start a morning at a protest or a rally with hostage families and then go to a museum or interview someone about their exhibit or their work or their what have you. And I was at what's called Shift 101, capital S. That is the mostly silent protesters who wear white, and they usually sit in front of major government institutions or public institutions or traffic intersections. And I went to one to see which hostage family members were there, and there was Varda Ben Baruch, who was the grandmother, the very lovely, strong, elegant grandmother of hostage Idan Alexander, and she was sitting right next to Vicky Cohen, who is the mother of hostage Nimrod, who is a soldier, and who, as you say, is being kept in horrific conditions, at least what they know of until now. And Vicky and I were speaking about how she is and these last signs of life that they received. In fact, the first sign of life they received was from a video of the Horn brothers of Yair and Eitan. And in that video, they caught sight of not of Nimrod, not of her son's face, but of a tattoo that he got 3 days before October 7th, a tattoo of a crow on his arm. And that is how they identified him. And then they heard from other released hostages kept with him about these horrific conditions. So what does she do? She happens to be someone who illustrates for fun on the side, or used to for fun. Now she thinks of it as a kind of meditation, a way to take her mind off when she's not speaking or interviewing or at protests or at rallies. And her illustrations are lovely. She basically took all the images that she thinks of when she thinks of both released hostages who are still in Gaza, and drew them into the story of the Haggadah. She took an existing Haggadah text for children, and she added released hostage Romy Gonen's love of leopard fabric and put it on a figure of the 4 children. And she took Shlomo Mansour, a murdered hostage, but who had this amazing handlebar mustache, and put that on someone else. And as you said, Emily Damari's hand, and scorpions at Ohad Yahalomi, a Nir Oz hostage who was murdered in captivity, but who worked for the Parks Authority and researched scorpions and put in a little scorpion there. And she said it helps. She did it in about a week. And she was showing me, scrolling through photos on her phone, just showing me how she did this. And that was something that was helpful for her. And then on the same Haggadah subject, the Hostages Forum, which works with the families of the hostages, put out their second Haggadah, because this is the second Passover in which hostages are still in Gaza. And they added texts from families of hostages who are still in Gaza, from released hostages, from bereaved families, adding texts and ideas that relate to the content of the Haggadah. And add another layer. Liri Albag, one of the surveillance soldiers who was released, she wrote this beautiful couple of paragraphs about how she and Agam Berger wrote their own Haggadah in captivity with what they had and what they could remember. And it just was a way of marking that day for them. And I just want to add one more thing about all of it. John Polin, the father of Hirsch Goldberg Polin, has been saying on social media and saying this publicly that it's just so important. And even though you're going to be hearing this after the Seder, well, after the first Seder, that everyone realizes this is the second Passover, the second set of Seders in which there are still hostages in Egypt. And I heard this in an interview with Idit Ohel, the mother of Alon Ohel, who is still in captivity, that the Seder is about captivity, is about freedom. And there is a very deep sense among many, many Israelis that we are very much not free on this Passover. And it's something to think about as we go into the holiday and as we experience the holiday. Something I'm thinking about as well.
Likewise, and most of Israel as well. Jessica, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Amanda. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.